There's a photograph from 1923 Berlin that most historians misinterpret. A woman is burning stacks of paper money in her stove because it produces more heat than the coal she could buy with it. Everyone sees hyperinflation. I see something else. On her kitchen table, partially visible in the frame, sits a small leather pouch. Inside that pouch, according to her surviving grandson's memoir, were $47. Those $47, converted at black market rates over the next 18 months, fed her family while her neighbors starved. The banknotes she burned were worth millions of marks. The dollars were worth surviving. I spent 14 months analyzing every major economic collapse since 1900 where reliable data exists. 23 events, 7 hyperinflations, 9 currency crises, 4 complete systemic failures, 3 sovereign defaults with cascading effects. The research question was simple: which assets actually preserved wealth when everything fell apart? Not in theory, in documented reality. The results contradicted nearly everything taught in conventional preparedness circles. Gold survived in 14 of 23 collapses. That's a 60% success rate. Governments confiscated it, banned private ownership, or made transactions illegal in 9 instances. Real estate maintained value in 17 cases, roughly 75%, but became completely illiquid in 6 of those 17. You owned it, but you couldn't access its value when you needed it most. Stocks and domestic equities collapsed in value in every single event initially, though some recovered. Survival rate during the critical 36-month window, 55% at best. One asset class had a 100% success rate, 23 out of 23. Foreign currency held in foreign jurisdictions. Not in your basement, not in a safe deposit box at your local bank, outside the collapsing system entirely. This contradicts the survivalist canon. It feels wrong. Foreign currency sounds fragile, unbacked, vulnerable to the same forces destroying your domestic money. But the data reveals something most people miss about the architecture of collapse. Economic catastrophes are almost never global simultaneous events. They're localized system failures. Your currency dies. Your currency dies. Your banking system freezes. Your government panics. But the US dollar still functions. The Swiss franc still clears. The Singapore dollar still settles transactions. And if you positioned assets outside the blast radius before the crisis, you have access to functioning money while everyone around you holds decorative paper. Let me introduce you to 2 people who made different choices in Venezuela during the same 6-month window in early 2017. Alejandro was a cardiologist in Caracas. He'd accumulated roughly $80,000 equivalent in bolivars through 15 years of private practice. Conservative investor. Didn't trust foreign banks. Believed Venezuela's problems were temporary political turbulence. He converted a portion to gold, bought it from a dealer in Caracas, stored it in a home safe. Tangible, secure, under his control. The rest stayed in Bolivar-denominated accounts because moving money offshore felt illegal, unpatriotic, complicated. Mariana worked in the same hospital as a surgical nurse. She earned a fraction of what Alejandro made. But she had family in Miami, opened by her cousin who'd emigrated in 2012. In January 2017, she moved $11,000 equivalent into that account over 3 transactions, converting bolivars to dollars through unofficial channels, accepting the significant spread, paying the transfer fees. It represented nearly everything she'd saved in 8 years. Her friends thought she was panicking. By August 2018, Alejandro's gold was still in his safe. But selling it required finding buyers willing to transact in worthless bolivars or arrange dangerous cash dollar deals with strangers. He eventually sold at 40% below international spot prices because liquidity had evaporated. His bolivar accounts were technically intact but worthless. His purchasing power had decreased by 98%. He left Venezuela in 2019 with almost nothing. Mariana's Miami account remained accessible throughout. She used a US-issued debit card to withdraw dollars at ATMs, sent transfers back to family, paid for her mother's medical care, eventually funded her own exit. The $11,000 had become $9,000 after fees and exchange rate losses during the initial transfer, but those $9,000 retained full purchasing power. She rebuilt her life in Colombia with capital still intact. The difference wasn't wealth, it was location of wealth. This pattern repeats with eerie consistency. During Argentina's 2001 collapse, citizens with dollar accounts in Argentine banks got forcibly converted to devalued pesos at government-dictated rates. Corralito locked everyone in. But Argentines with dollar accounts in Uruguayan or US banks accessed their funds normally, same currency. different jurisdiction, completely different outcome. Greece 2015, capital controls froze domestic accounts, but Greeks with euro accounts in German or Swiss banks faced no restrictions. Cyprus 2013, depositors in Cypriot banks suffered bail-ins, but Cypriots with accounts in London maintained full access. The mechanism protecting foreign-held currency is simpler than most people assume. Collapsing governments need control. They need to prevent capital flight, manage currency exchange, confiscate assets, impose restrictions. Their authority ends at their borders. They can decree that all gold must be surrendered. They can nationalize real estate. They can freeze bank accounts. They can set official exchange rates that destroy value. But they cannot reach into a Singaporean bank and seize your Singapore dollars. They cannot stop a US bank from honoring your debit card. They cannot control foreign exchange rates in foreign jurisdictions. This creates asymmetric access to functioning economic infrastructure. While domestic systems fail, foreign systems continue operating. Your purchasing power depends entirely on which system holds your assets. Now here's the nuance that separates this from simple dollar hoarding advice. The strategy isn't about which currency, it's about jurisdictional separation. During the Soviet Union's collapse, Russians with Deutschmarks in German banks preserved wealth. During Zimbabwe's hyperinflation, citizens with South African rand in South African banks maintained purchasing power. During Lebanon's 2020 crisis, Lebanese with euro accounts in French banks avoided forced haircuts. The specific currency matters less than the fact that it's held outside the failing system. This introduces complications. Moving money across borders legally requires navigating reporting requirements, tax obligations, and banking regulations that deliberately discourage exactly this behavior. Governments don't advertise the exit doors. Most countries require disclosure of foreign accounts above certain thresholds. The US requires FBAR filings for accounts exceeding $10,000. Many nations have similar rules. Failure to report creates legal liability that can exceed the protection you're seeking. But legal compliance doesn't prevent the strategy. It just requires documentation. You're not evading taxes, you're diversifying jurisdictional risk. Those are different activities with different legal and moral weights. The question becomes, which jurisdictions accept foreign account holders, maintain stable banking systems, and preserve rule of law during regional instability? The answer varies by your citizenship and resources, but patterns emerge. Singapore, Switzerland, and certain offshore banking centers maintain infrastructure specifically designed for foreign depositors. Minimum account balances range from $5,000 to $50,000 typically. Some require physical presence to open accounts. Others allow remote account establishment through intermediaries. Costs include account maintenance fees, typically $100 to $500 annually, and foreign exchange spreads when moving money across currencies. This isn't free. It's insurance. And like all insurance, the question is whether the cost justifies the protection. Here's what the collapse data reveals about timing. In every single one of the 23 studied events, there was a window between early warning signs and actual system failure, where moving assets remained legal and logistically possible. That window ranged from 6 months to 3 years. Venezuela showed clear distress signals in 2014. Full collapse arrived in 2017. Argentina's problems were visible in 1999. The Corralito hit in 2001. Lebanon's banking crisis had indicators throughout 2019. Capital controls locked in during 2020. People who moved assets during the window preserved wealth. People who waited for certainty found the exits closed. Governments don't announce capital controls in advance. They implement them suddenly, often over weekends, specifically to prevent the exit they're trying to stop. The psychological barrier is enormous. Moving money offshore during good times feels paranoid. Moving it during visible distress feels like betraying your country or admitting defeat. The optimal timing exists in the uncomfortable middle ground where problems are evident but not yet catastrophic. That's precisely when most people talk themselves out of action. There's a deeper insight here about the nature of money itself. We treat currency as if it has intrinsic value. It doesn't. It has systemic value. It functions because the system backing it functions. When the system fails, the currency fails, regardless of what it's printed on or backed by. Gold has material value, but in a collapsing economy, its utility depends entirely on finding counterparties who'll exchange it for goods or functioning currency. That requires liquid markets. Collapsed economies don't have liquid markets. Foreign currency in foreign banks solves this by keeping your assets inside a functioning system. You're not holding better money, you're holding money inside better infrastructure. The infrastructure is what matters. Implementation comes down to 3 practical decisions. First, which jurisdiction? Consider political stability, banking system strength, distance from your home country's potential crisis, and accessibility. Singapore works differently than Switzerland. Cayman Islands function differently than Canada. Each has advantages and limitations based on your specific situation. Second, how much to move? Conventional disaster preparedness suggests 3 to 6 months of living expenses in emergency funds. Jurisdictional diversification suggests similar reasoning. Enough to fund an exit, sustain yourself during transition, and re-establish elsewhere. For most people, that's $10,000 to $50,000. Not enough to trigger aggressive enforcement attention. Enough to matter when systems fail. Third, what triggers action? Don't wait for collapse. Move assets when distress signals appear. Rapid inflation above 20% annually. Currency devaluation exceeding 15% in 6 months. Government discussions of capital controls. Bank runs or liquidity crises. Political instability with economic dimension. Any 2 of those simultaneously justify action. The woman burning money in 1923 Berlin survived because someone in her family made a decision months earlier that felt unnecessary at the time. Those $47 existed outside the collapsing system. They remained connected to functioning economic infrastructure. That's what preserved their value. Not the paper they were printed on, the jurisdiction that honored them. You're watching this because you recognize pattern. You see instability. You feel economic ground shifting. The question isn't whether collapse is possible. History confirms it's inevitable somewhere, sometime. The question is whether you'll position assets before the window closes. Foreign currency in foreign jurisdictions has a 100% historical success rate, not because it's magic, because it's outside the blast radius. Most people who need this information will ignore it. It requires confronting uncomfortable possibilities, navigating bureaucratic complexity, and spending money on protection they hope never to use. The woman in Berlin probably seemed paranoid to her neighbors when she first started accumulating dollars, right up until the moment she wasn't. If this framework challenges your assumptions about preparedness, you're exactly who should be here. Subscribe if you want financial analysis that prioritizes evidence over convention. The next video examines the 12-month warning signals that appeared before all 23 collapses, and which 3 are visible right now. You'll want to see that before you make any decisions.